All right, welcome to the beginning of Module 4. This is our first lecture for this module, and we're starting off here talking about the 1960s. And our last lecture of Module 3, Civil Rights Movement, is a really good segue into the developments of the 1960s because it sets the groundwork for these individual rights movements like the African American Civil Rights Movement that focused on promoting the agenda of a specific group of people to create greater equality within the United States as a whole. That inspiration is going to move through a number of different groups during the 1960s and create this very individualistic, rebellious culture of the 1960s. So as we get started here, note that you do have 3 ID terms for this lecture, so make note of those early on. And then let's set the context of what the 1960s was like before we get any further into some of the examples of the movements that I'm going to give you. So the characteristics of the 1960s culture. When we say the 1960s, we're really talking about what we call the long 1960s, which is 1957 through 1972. History usually isn't so cooperative as to begin a new age just as a new decade begins and then ended when the decade ends. And so when we say the 1960s, we are talking about this 15-year period from 1957 to 1972 in which this culture that we're going to discuss really dominated the United States. The basis of the 1960s culture is a rejection of the consensus that began in the 1950s. If you remember, we talked about consensus as the answer to our fear and anxiety in the 1950s. We all agreed that everything should be the same, that there was one way to be an American, that it was a suburban life with a white picket fence and a happy family and all of these things that were just so. Everything fell into its little boxes and checked off all of its little check marks. And so in the 1960s, the children of this consensus generation reject that completely, and they form what we call a counterculture. Now, counterculture is the technical term for what you might know as hippie culture. Hippie is not really as technical of a term, although we all know what it means, and it's really interchangeable with the idea of counterculture. So it's this free lifestyle, no rules, different kinds of clothing, homespun materials, woven sandals, a lot of drugs, long hair, living outside, rejecting institutions, all of those kinds of things are part of this counterculture, this rejection of consensus. And there's a focus on the concept of individual rights. People were fighting for the rights of people to be themselves, to be original, to be unique within society. And again, this is a rejection of consensus because consensus said we all need to be the same in order to promote the best thing for society as a whole. And counterculture says, no, this is about an individual person's right to be who they are, regardless of the impact that that has on society. And then, of course, along with this goes a rebellion against authority. There was a rebellion against institutions like universities and the government and businesses and any structure that we could call the quote-unquote man would be something that the 1960s counterculture would rebel against. And this movement is dominated by the youth. These are the baby boomers who have reached their teenage years, and they are going to start pushing back against all of this. And a lot of that is also because they don't have anything to lose. They've grown up in an environment that has seemed relatively well off and safe, and they have access to money, and they've had good lives out in the suburbs, and now they feel like they're going to do whatever they want to do to make the world the place that they want it to be. Now, I've included these pictures here. These two are both wedding pictures, and it shows you the dramatic difference between the 1950s and the 1960s. This was a photograph of a wedding from the 1950s, and you can see that this is very traditional. He's in a suit, his little corsage there. That's not what it's called. It's called a boutonniere. There we go. She's got her flowers. She's in her classic style wedding dress. Everything looks very polished and very traditional. This is a wedding from the 1960s, and you can see these homespun materials in her clothing, this new style. You can see the flowers in her hair, and I don't know what this is in his hat, but it could potentially be an illegal substance. It's just a very different world. And music festivals like the one pictured here were really popular places for people to exercise this rejection of consensus, this counterculture. A lot of the movements that arise out of this overarching counterculture are led, as I said, by young people, by college students. In 1962, 60 college students began an organization called Students for a Democratic Society, and they developed the Port Huron Statement as their mission for their society. And part of that Port Huron Statement says, "We seek the establishment of a democracy of individual participation in which the individual shares in those social decisions determining the quality and direction of his life." What this means is it's a rejection of institutions, certainly a criticism of institutions, but more so this quote demonstrates that they wanted people to start taking an active role. Those individuals whose rights they were fighting for, they wanted them to actively participate in making decisions that determine their everyday life. So it's a rejection of government and institutions, but also a call to participate in democracy. Across campuses in the 1960s, you're going to see student protests, but nowhere did they have more student protests than Berkeley. Berkeley, California was a hotbed and still is considered to be a hotbed of liberal thought. And in 1964, the campus became so overwhelmed with the number of protests that were happening there that they actually prohibited political speech in the campus center. They told these protesters that they didn't deny the right to protest, but they said that they could not do it in the campus center, which was where most of these protests had been happening. And this infuriates these student activists on campus. And Mario Savio, who was one of their leaders, said that freedom of expression, quote, "represents the very dignity of what a human being is. That's what marks us off from the stone to the stars," which indicates just how passionately these students felt about their right to express their beliefs. They believed it was what made them human, what gave them dignity. And they launch a protest against the removal of their right to protest. And they start staging walkouts, and teachers back them on this. Teachers cancel classes, they sit in the hallways, they block traffic, they do all of these things until there's so much pressure on the university that their university repeals the ban of free speech in early 1965. And the significance of this is that it shows the kind of power and influence that these young student activists had, that institutions often caved under the immense pressure that these students put on them. Now, technically, the university had not broken the law by prohibiting political speech in the campus center because they had not said that the students couldn't protest anywhere. They only designated a particular space in which they could not. And that's similar to the university that you all attend, UCA. There is a place outside that chapel near the student center where you can protest and express your opinions, but not other places around campus to avoid protests from inhibiting people's day-to-day activities. Now, what we're going to do next is we're going to look at a series of movements that embody this counterculture, individualistic, rebellion against authority type mentality of the 1960s, because we just have a lot of these that we can look at. Different groups were organizing and fighting for their rights within this more accepting individualistic culture. And so the first one we're going to look at is the gay rights movement, which began technically in 1951 with the formation of the Mattachine Society. This was the first organization that was trying to promote gay rights. But the reason that it doesn't really take off in the 1950s is that there's so much backlash against homosexuals that it's not even considered to be a valid group. In fact, it is considered to be a mental illness at this time. And so the Mattachine Society's job was to start changing opinions about what it meant to be gay. Was it a mental disease? Was it a lifestyle choice? Was it a valid option? And so their movement is far behind a lot of these other movements that we're talking about. For instance, when we get to the women's movement, nobody has ever questioned whether or not being a woman is a mental illness. And so there's a different set of challenges facing the gay population. And so from 1951 and throughout the 1960s, this gay rights movement is remaining relatively quiet, relatively behind the scenes. They're doing things like trying to create places where homosexual people can gather to talk to others like them, to have support. And they actually do that in bars a lot. They start developing gay bars, particularly in places like New York City. Greenwich Village within New York City was a hotspot for homosexual lifestyle, and there was a bar there called the Stonewall Bar that was a known homosexual gathering spot. Well, in 1969, the police will raid the Stonewall Bar, and they did these raids often on these gathering spots because it was a crime to engage in homosexual behavior, which was defined very loosely, to engage in homosexual behavior in public. And so they would often go into these bars and just start arresting all the people that were within the bar. And what makes the raid on Stonewall Bar different in 1969 was that the people within the bar fought back against the police as a unit for the first time. And this will lead to 5 days of rioting, not necessarily between the police and the homosexual population, but amongst the people of Greenwich Village as they came down on different sides of this issue. And these 5 days of rioting will lead to many arrests, many injuries, a discussion of the issues, but it also will lead to the gay pride movement. And this is a much more public version of the movement that had been taking place since 1951. It was one in which the homosexual population would put on parades, they would walk through the streets holding hands, they would raise awareness, they would have banners and symbols of who they were, and all of this became much more out in the open in 1969 as a result of the Stonewall Bar raid. And this movement, of course, is still continuing on today and has made many advances in the last few years, well, the last 10 years. Another example of a movement in the 1960s is the women's movement. We talked about the women's movement back in the 1910s and the 1920s when we talked about suffrage and the ERA. But once the Great Depression hit, it really was not acceptable for women to continue to promote rights for women when the country was going through a Great Depression, a war, and then in the 1950s there was that strong backlash against women being outside of the house. And so for about 30 years, the women's movement has really been placed on hold and even taken some steps back in terms of how society views women, like you saw in the Leave It to Beaver clips that you discussed last week. So in the 1960s, this is going to change, and it really begins to change when a woman named Betty Friedan writes a book in 1963 called The Feminine Mystique. And this book does a lot of things, but one of the things that it does is it acknowledges for the first time in a long time out loud in a published piece of work that women are discontented in the home. This was something that was taboo for women to admit, especially during the 1950s when they were supposed to be oh so happy and content with their new wonderful suburban lifestyles. But Betty Friedan says, no, women are discontent. A lot of them are, and it's not because they hate their husbands or hate their children or hate their homes. It's because they need something outside of that also. And this is a rallying cry for the women's movement to begin again. Now, early on, this women's movement, this feminism movement, is focused on things like equality in the workplace and in education. They want women to have equal pay as men. And they get the Equal Pay Act in 1963, which may sound confusing because you hear in the news a lot of things today about how women get paid 75 cents on the dollar or 80 cents on the dollar for what a man makes. And that can be true in some areas. We have a lot, particularly in Hollywood, a lot of women publishing that they're paid less for their roles in movies or television shows than men are, and that can happen. But it's a mistake to think that, for instance, I'm a college professor, and in my department there are other college professors who are men, and we are paid exactly the same. We have to be by law. I can't be paid less for being a woman than a man doing my same job with my same qualifications, and that's because of the Equal Pay Act. When people say that overall women make less than men, they're looking at it collectively. they're adding up all of the incomes between men and women in the country, and they're recognizing the fact that women on the whole make about 75% of what men make. But that's because that we still have more men in doctors' positions, CEO positions, lawyer positions, things that make people a lot more money. Those are still jobs being occupied by men. So a man and a woman doing the same job with the same qualifications have to be paid the same by law, according to the Equal Pay Act. So don't get those two things confused when people are talking about how women make less than men. It means something different than what people might assume that it means. The National Organization for Women, which we abbreviate as NOW, begins in 1966, and they continue to fight for equality in the workplace. And so this original version of the modern feminist movement is very much focused on a few specific things, mostly economic things. But in 1968, this movement, this women's movement, will begin to radicalize. And we'll start to get other groups of women not associated with NOW or Betty Friedan, who are protesting some cultural issues that they see for women just in the world as a whole, outside of the workplace. For instance, a group of activists will protest the Miss America beauty pageant in 1968 by standing outside with signs that show women being divided up into cuts of meat, and the indication there is that women are being sexualized for men's pleasure, that they are treated as objects instead of as independent individuals who should be valued outside of their appearance or their sexuality. And so that starts the movement on a slightly more radical path starting in 1968. Most movements radicalize in 1968. Another example of a radical movement in 1968 is the formation of an organization called WITCH, W-I-T-C-H, which stands for Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell. And these lovely ladies are pictured here dressed up as witches with painted traffic cones on their head and brooms. And they would chant their protests in the street dressed as witches. And they were the first organization that we know of who actually said that women were superior to men. It's not about equality, it's about superiority. They said that men had ruined the world, they had had their chance to rule, and now it should be the female's time to take power. So a very quick radicalization of this feminist movement that starts with issues about economic equality and turns into a terrorist conspiracy from hell in the matter of a few years. Another movement during the 1960s is the environmental movement, which kicks off with the release of a book called Silent Spring in 1962, which talked about the harmful consequences of DDT on the environment. DDT was a pesticide that farmers were using to grow better crops quickly, and it's very detrimental to the environment as a whole. DDT is mentioned in a song from 1970 called Big Yellow Taxi, which you may or may not have heard of. There's been several covers of it since then, but it actually mentions the harmful effects of DDT in the song, which shows that these movements were penetrating 1960s culture, and 1960s culture was penetrating these movements. They are one and the same. The environmental movement on its more mainstream and promoted things like the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts, the Endangered Species Act, the First Earth Day, and things like that to help protect the environment. On the less mainstream end, it's what's pictured here, where people will actually move back out away from society and start communes where they live off of the earth and try to make their environmental footprint at zero, and often it would go along with this sort of free love, free society lifestyle that was popular in the 1960s. The last movement that I'm going to use as an example is the American Indian movement. And this one is very different from the others, largely because it was not as successful or as long-term as the others. Native Americans have had a very troubled relationship with the United States government since the beginning, since before the United States government, because of how they were living here first. And then colonists came over from European countries and started to kick them out of their land. And so the Native American population in the United States has never been all that thrilled um, about the situation. But starting in the 1950s, Truman had implemented a policy called termination, which was the idea that we would do away with the reservations that Native Americans had been given to live on and integrate American Indians into traditional American life. And that was, again, a part of the Cold War mentality to make everybody the same. And the Indian population really resents this. But then in the 1960s, Johnson begins to pour funds back into the reservations to try to improve them. And the Native culture resents that as well, because what they really want is to be left alone. They don't want to have their land taken. They don't want to have their land funded by the government. They just kind of want to be left alone. And so this all culminates in 1969 into the formation of the Indians of All Nations, which was a intertribal group of Native Americans who occupied Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay and claimed it as their own land, that they were there first. And you can see that here in this picture. Indian land, United Indian Property, etc. They took this over for about 3 years, and it got a lot of publicity because they were occupying this island out in San Francisco Bay and claiming it. Now, this will launch the Red Power movement, which is a movement that works on the same foundation as the Black Power movement, an acceptance of culture, a promotion of the beauty of being a Native American, a celebration of that culture, a fight for rights. But the reason that you probably have not heard of this movement before and probably cannot point to anything significant in our current time that really promotes this agenda is because it was a largely ignored movement. The other three that we talked about, the gay rights movement, the women's movement, the environmental movement, we see the lingering impact of that even in our culture today, but not with the American Indian movement. So it's a very different example of a movement that was equally valid and equally important, but for a variety of reasons did not really take off during the 1960s. So those are 4 examples of movements that within this idea of an individualistic counterculture attempted to make change in the world. In addition to these movements, you have the sexual liberation of the 1960s, the drug culture of the 1960s. Everybody was feeling free to explore sexuality, to explore substances, to explore alternative lifestyles of all varieties. And it was all out of this rejection of consensus. And it's going to do a lot to promote these individual groups. It's also going to cause a lot of angst that's going to lead into the 1970s, which we will also be talking about in this module. So whenever you're ready, you can move on to our next lecture, which is